Hello, everyone. Welcome to MIT Sloan Alumni Online. Every month, MIT Sloan Alumni Online brings you the latest breaking news, cutting-edge research, groundbreaking ideas, and school updates from MIT Sloan faculty, alumni, and students. Today, we are honored to have Professor John Sterman, the J.W. Forrester Professor of Management, Director of the MIT Sloan System Dynamic Group, and Faculty Director of the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative with us. I won't go into more depth in his bio since there's so much to talk about today. So without further ado, Professor Sterman, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, Renee, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you. It's actually a fortuitous day to talk about this issue of climate change, since it's now widely being reported that President Trump will follow through on his campaign promise to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. So there's a great deal to talk about, and I'd like to get right into it. The question is, how do we summarize this vast issue? And I'm going to borrow from my colleague, Tony Lazarowitz at Yale, and summarize the climate change issue in 10 words. First of all, it's real, it's us, humans cause it, it's bad, threatens our prosperity, our health, and our lives. Scientists agree, there's no reasonable doubt about this, and there's hope. And I would add to this that you personally, each of you, can make a difference on this issue. So first, is it real? I won't spend much time on this, but here you see global average temperatures since 1880. And although there's annual variation, some wiggles and jiggles due to the internal variability of the climate, the upward trend, the warming of our planet is unequivocal. And in fact, since the 1880s, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have warmed our world by at least 1 to 1.2 degrees C. So that's already more than halfway to the 2-degree target that's endorsed by the scientific community and enshrined in the Paris Agreement. The cause of this is human activity. There's no doubt about that. In the top graph, you see carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere as measured at the Keeling Observatory in Hawaii, far from any local point source distortions, growing at an accelerating rate and now above 400 parts per million compared to about 280 parts per million pre-industrial levels. And in the bottom graph, you see 600,000 years of carbon dioxide concentration history from ice core data. And we are now at a level that has not been seen in at least the past 650,000 years, and it's rising faster now due to industrial activity than at any time in at least millions of years. So there's no question that the cause of the warming we've observed is human activity. It's potentially catastrophic for humans. If we had 4 degrees C or about 7 Fahrenheit of warming, we risk catastrophe, and I use that word with all deliberation. We're looking at multi-meter sea level rise by 2100 and far more, perhaps as much as 15 meters or up to 50 feet in the longer term, and even more is possible if the Antarctic ice sheets and Greenland collapse, as many scientists believe they are now doing. We're looking at more frequent and intense heat waves, more floods, more drought, with significant declines in crop yields. A number of studies estimate that for the big 4 grains, maize, rice, wheat, and sorghum, you could be seeing global average crop yield declines of 40% or more well before the end of this century. Carbon dioxide causes ocean acidification, which threatens the productivity of all the food webs in the ocean upon which ocean life and many human lives depend. Climate change creates faster rates of extinction and the potential for irreversible ecosystem change. And there's the possibility of crossing climate tipping points, which would mean that reinforcing feedbacks would take over, such as the melting of permafrost, making a great deal of previously frozen carbon available for bacteria and fungi to eat. And as they respire, that produces more methane and CO2, which further warms the planet and melts even more permafrost. So we don't know if we've crossed any of these, but the warmer it gets, the higher the likelihood that that will happen. So what do scientists think about that? 97% of climate scientists believe that the evidence unequivocally shows that climate change is happening and it's caused by human activity. But in the bottom here, you see that the public's opinion in the United States and other countries lags behind. So as of now, this is quite recent, 70% of people in the United States believe that the climate is changing, that warming is happening now, and a majority believe that it's caused by human activities. Now, that's a large majority, 70%, but it's nowhere near what the evidence suggests, and it's one of the reasons that action has been lagging. So what does the Paris Agreement that the President is about to announce the U.S. will withdraw from, what does it actually do? So here at MIT Sloan, and in partnership with Climate Interactive, a nonprofit group which includes many Sloan and MIT alumni, we have analyzed this question for many years, and here you see a summary of our current assessment. Under business as usual, we're headed for over 4 degrees C or over 7.6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming by the year 2100. As I just described, that risks catastrophe to our prosperity, our health, and our lives. If the Paris Agreement and all other announced national policies were fully implemented, we would take off about 1 degree. We'd be at about 3.3 degrees C or 6 Fahrenheit of warming. The goal or the limit for the amount of warming that's tolerable is 2 degrees C and, quote, striving for 1.5 degrees C as enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So 2 degrees C is 3.6 Fahrenheit, 1.5 is 2.8. So although the Paris Agreement is a major step forward, it is still not sufficient. Let's take a closer look at that. So here you see what underlies the analysis. Now we're using the C-ROADS climate simulation model that Climate Interactive and our group here at MIT Sloan have developed. This model has been peer-reviewed, it's fully documented, it's freely available. You can go online and get the model and try your own scenarios and examine every formulation and equation for yourself. So I'm going to leave that for you to follow up. And what you see here in this graph is the reference case, business as usual, with emissions globally growing, not as fast as the world economy because there's some technical progress even in the business as usual case. And that carries us to 4.2 C or 7.6 Fahrenheit. The line in the middle labeled national plans is the impact of full compliance with Paris and all announced mid-century strategies. So our philosophy in this analysis is we are taking every nation of the world at its word that they will fully implement and achieve their commitments under the Paris Agreement and any policies they've announced to go beyond 2030 when the Paris commitments end. But we are not crediting nations with actions they have not pledged to make. So what happens here is that emissions flatten out between now and about 2030, but then they begin to rise again because of continuing population and economic growth around the world, and particularly in the developing nations. By contrast, you can see the two pathways here labeled 2 degrees and 1.5, showing that in order to have any decent probability of hitting that 2-degree limit that's in the Paris Agreement, global emissions need to peak before 2030 and then begin to fall at a very substantial rate through the rest of the century. That shows the magnitude of the emissions gap or the need for increased ambition. Now, let's break it down and look further at what the U.S. commitment to the Paris Agreement is, and therefore what will potentially not happen under the current administration's plan to withdraw. So here you see U.S. emissions, historical data up through last year, and then the projection for business as usual showing a slight rise, and then the dashed line is the Paris Agreement. So by 2025, the U.S. has pledged a 25 to 28% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions compared to the year 2005. How is that going to be attained? Well, under the prior administration, a large chunk of it would be attained through the Clean Power Plan. and then additional wedges of emissions reductions through the automobile CAFE standards, through the regulations to limit methane releases from both the oil industry and from the natural gas industry and from agriculture. Also, nitrous oxide, N2O, is a significant greenhouse gas primarily generated from agriculture. And then you see a wedge from efficiency, Energy Star, and similar programs, and the Kigali Agreement, which is an international treaty to which the United States is a party that limits the hydrofluorocarbons and other fluorine F gases, as they're called, which are potent greenhouse gas generators. There's also a wedge here for California, which shows California's state policies that go over and above the federal policies. And you'll notice that even adding all of those up, you still fall a little bit short of what we committed to meet the Paris commitment we pledged. Under the Trump administration, they have indicated that they will abandon the Clean Power Plan. They've already indicated that they are planning to roll back or revisit the CAFE standards. They sought to repeal the methane regulation, and that failed in the Senate, but by a vote of 51 to 49. They've indicated they are looking at rolling back the Energy Star and other efficiency regulations, and so forth. So what this indicates is that even without withdrawing from Paris, they've already put into place a set of policies and promised additional actions that would cause U.S. emissions to be above the line that's indicated here. Now, how much above is not fully known, because there's the possibility that states, municipalities, businesses will take action that offsets some of the policies that are being abandoned, but we don't know how much that's going to be. Now, what impact will this have on the global emissions pathway? So here you see from our simulations the impact of the United States in achieving the full implementation of Paris. So the red wedge here represents the decline in U.S. emissions that we just showed you in order to meet the Paris commitment. And when you add up the cumulative emissions reductions over this period from today through 2030, the U.S. would constitute 21% of the global greenhouse gas emissions reductions if all parties fully complied with Paris. That's a very substantial chunk. Now, as I mentioned, given the current administration's announced policies and the report, as seems very likely, that President Trump will withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, that red wedge is going to be smaller. U.S. emissions reductions under the current administration's policies will be smaller. It's not necessarily the case that it'll go all the way to zero, because cities, states, and other entities at the subnational level and businesses may take action that pushes ahead with efficiency improvements and emissions reductions. But on the other hand, there's also a risk that U.S. abandonment of Paris, or worse, withdrawal from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, would trigger a cascade of goal erosion by other nations who might then fail to meet their commitments. So let's take a look at that in a little more detail. So the graph here again shows a simulation from the C-ROADS model with the reference case. The green line, scenario 2, is global emissions all the way out to 2100, assuming all nations fully comply with their Paris commitments and any other announced mid-century strategies. But again, we're not crediting nations with actions they have not announced and not pledged to make. And the red curve, scenario 3, shows global emissions out to 2100 if the U.S. were to do nothing and follow its BAU path. So again, you can see that the U.S. matters quite a lot. Now, actual U.S. emissions will be somewhere between scenario 2, the green line, and scenario 3, if businesses and subnational entities step up and fill in some of the gap. But emissions would be higher if U.S. withdrawal weakens action by other nations. So why might that happen? Well, first of all, the mere uncertainty about what the U.S. might do, and even after President Trump formally announces withdrawal from Paris or possibly withdrawal from the entire Framework Convention process, there will still be significant uncertainty about when, how, by how much, what does it mean, what policies will be taken in the United States. And that uncertainty, as we all know, is harmful to business. And it's likely to slow investment in renewables, wind, solar, and especially efficiency, not only in the United States, but around the world. And that has knock-on effects. So because there are such strong learning curves, experience curves, scale economies, and other processes that lower the cost of wind and solar and storage technologies, every time somebody puts up a wind turbine or puts in a solar installation, it lowers the cost of all future such installations because of those scale economies and learning curve effects. So if there's uncertainty today, which there clearly is, and that slows down investment in those renewables and in efficiency, it will keep those technologies from going down their learning curve, their experience curve as fast, and will slow down their deployment for years to come. Secondly, other nations may retaliate for U.S. inaction, for U.S. withdrawal. So far, fortunately, all the other major nations who have spoken on this issue since the election have indicated that regardless of the actions of the Trump administration, whatever they may turn out to be, that those nations are going to stay the course and they intend to fully meet their Paris commitments. This includes China, this includes the EU, and a number of other major emitting nations. However, the leaders of those nations face increasing political pressure from populists and nationalists, as we've seen in this country, as we saw with Brexit, as we see in Europe and other countries around the world. So it is quite possible that in future elections, some not too far from now, that new administrations could come into power in some of these nations, or that to appease the populist faction of their citizenry, the current leadership may accede to the argument that if the U.S. does less, then why should we cut our emissions? You could, in addition, face retaliation from some nations and outrage over the historical responsibility for much of the climate problem that's due to the developed nations, who indeed have cumulatively used most of the carbon energy that's been burned and therefore are responsible for most of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere today. This is an argument that has been going on ever since the beginning of the climate negotiations over 20 years ago. And it is one with considerable moral force. By what right do the developed nations, including the U.S., have to tell India, Indonesia, Africa, Latin America that, I'm sorry, you can't burn fossil fuel because we used it all up. We used up all the carbon that the atmosphere can stand. And this is a major argument that's sure to gain increased force in the developing nations as the U.S. withdraws from the Paris process. Finally, the final issue leading to a potential cascade of goal erosion from the Paris Agreement is that with the U.S. out and presumably no longer willing to contribute to the Green Climate Fund that was established at the Cancun Climate Conference in 2010, there will be less funds, fewer funds, less resources available to help the developing nations mitigate their emissions. And not only fewer funds from the U.S., but it's highly likely that if the U.S. doesn't contribute, other developing nations will likewise be under tremendous pressure to scale back their contributions. The idea here is simple. It's just no longer possible for developing nations to follow the traditional path of building a fossil energy system and then switching at some later date to renewables. That will certainly push us beyond the available carbon budget and lead us to warming far above 2 degrees. So what historical responsibility needs to mean now is that the developing nations need to fund the transition to a clean, renewable energy system in the developing world so they can leapfrog the fossil system, never build it out, in the same way that Africa leapfrogged landline telephony and jumped straight to mobile. This is a much bigger challenge than the telephony challenge, but this is now what the historical responsibility of the affluent nations needs. So that's the bad news. We could face, as a result of U.S. withdrawal from Paris or the FCCC, a cascade of goal erosion that could unravel the entire Paris Agreement. On the positive side, however, subnational actions and market forces may cause U.S. emissions to fall partway towards, maybe significantly towards, the Paris commitment, despite federal hostility to this issue. Many states, California and many others, have stepped up and said, we intend to continue and accelerate our efforts. Many cities have stepped up and said that they will adopt climate-friendly policies, and businesses are increasingly getting into the act. We'll talk about that again in a second, but there are additional knock-on effects of U.S. withdrawal from Paris that could harm U.S. interests. In particular, the U.S. is going to lose its seat at the table and some of its influence on what other nations do. A scenario that we really don't want to see for the United States is China and other large emitting countries establishing a carbon border adjustment tariff that would harm our exports to the rest of the world. We will clearly be ceding leadership in the emerging green economy, which is generating more jobs in the United States now than the economy as a whole, and certainly more than the carbon economy. We'll be ceding leadership in that to the other countries of the world, especially China, which is already the world leader in wind turbines and solar panels. And that's going to cost jobs here in the United States. Not only jobs manufacturing, renewable energy technologies, storage, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, but jobs installing, operating, and maintaining them. And those are jobs that can't be outsourced. And of course, there's the well-known national security threats that arise from climate change, sea level rise, drought, and so forth, including increased conflict, well-established through rigorous statistical work, increased migration, and more refugees. So that's the bad news. Now, is there any good news? Yes, there's hope. So what is the hope here? Well, many companies have stepped up and said, even if the president withdraws from Paris, even if the federal government remains hostile to climate-smart policies, we are going to cut our emissions because it's the right thing to do and it's good for business. And these are not just companies like Google and Amazon and Apple, but also Walmart, Bank of America, and dozens of other companies. And many cities and communities are stepping up. So for example, Atlanta has pledged to go 100% renewable by 2035. Now there's a lot of work to be done in order to get that to happen. And it would be better if we had a set of national policies that were aligned with that, because, for example, as much as Atlanta might do with building codes and solar and renewable power generation, unless the auto industry makes the transition to far more efficient vehicles powered by carbon-free energy, transportation in Atlanta is going to remain a very difficult activity. So what can we do? Well, in our work here at Sloan and with Climate Interactive, we have developed, as you've seen, a set of interactive simulation models. And these models have been used by senior policymakers in the United States. The prior administration used them extensively since the Copenhagen conference and also through the bilateral negotiation with China that led to a historic agreement in 2014, where China agreed for the first time to cap its emissions by 2030, and by nations including France and China and Brazil and the UN and so forth. But it's not enough for policymakers to use that model. We also have to increase grassroots support for climate-smart policies. And what we know from decades of research on risk communication and from our own teaching experience, and what you know as alums from your own classroom experience, is that nobody's going to change their mind just because somebody gives them a presentation. Research shows that showing people research doesn't work. So what we have done is we have developed our climate simulations into interactive learning tools. And I want to share that with you very briefly here. So as I just said, what we know is that lecture is boring. So I'm going to show you a little video clip here. And what it's going to show you is a controlled experiment that one of our team members, Professor Rooney Varga, did up at Cambridge Ringen Latin High School right here in Cambridge. So the control group is a group of high school students, and they received the standard lecture on climate change that many high school students might get. So let's take a look. So you don't have to hear the sound. The question is any learning happening in this classroom? And the answer is very clearly no. So the treatment is to give the students or business people or policymakers a chance to discover insights about how the climate works for themselves. So what we do is we've taken our model and used it to create a role-play negotiation of the global climate conferences, such as the Paris Agreement, last year's conference in Marrakesh, Morocco, and this year in Bonn, Germany. We call it the World Climate Role Play, and we divide participants up into different delegations representing the major emitting countries, the US, China, the EU, et cetera. And then they negotiate face-to-face. They get briefing memos. Here you see China's, just 2 pages with China's national interests and some data about climate and economic consequences of the issue. And then they negotiate face-to-face. Let me show you another video here. This is the treatment group of students at Ringen Latin High School after the negotiation has begun. And here they're negotiating over who's going to pay for emissions reductions. And it's clear that they are far more engaged. They're actually quite sophisticated in what they're saying and the negotiation. Who's going to pay? What are the interests? There's a lot more learning going on here. So does it work? Well, after they negotiate, they all announce what their commitments are, exactly as in the real climate negotiations. And then we enter their commitments into the same interactive simulation model that we use with the policymakers. We've put a user-friendly interface on it, but it's exactly the same simulation. It's not dumbed down in any way. And typical first-round results are usually something like this, very close to what Paris would accomplish. Here, in this example, getting the expected warming down to about 3.5 degrees C. And that, although it's safer than business as usual, is not safe and leads to severe harm. And then we show them, if they ask, what kinds of harms would there be? So for example, we show them what sea level rise might be. And we can show them with a website anywhere in the world they want to go. So people often ask about China. So here's Shanghai today. And under the policy that I just showed you, it's possible that sea level by 2100 could be as much as 2 meters higher than it is today. Well, if that occurred, this would be the consequence. Shanghai would be rendered largely uninhabitable because of sea level rise, flooding, and saltwater intrusion. But of course, it's worse than that because Shanghai and other cities in this region are subject to typhoons. And so what happens if there's a Typhoon Haiyan scale hit on Shanghai? This is quite likely over the next 100 years. The storm surge during a storm of that magnitude, like Haiyan, was 4 meters. So here's the result of 2 meters of sea level rise plus a 4-meter storm surge. This is total devastation. So now what's happening is that the participants in the role play are learning for themselves what the consequences of their own decisions are. We don't tell them what to pledge. We don't tell them what to do. They come to their own decisions, and then we simply show them what the consequences are. We also make it a little more dramatic by taking a tarp and using it to represent sea level, dragging it over their heads. And here you see a picture of that happening right here at Sloan a couple of years ago. Then we send them back for another round of negotiation. And the result is often a much better outcome. We don't tell them what to do, but they can spontaneously make a shift. They often do spontaneously make a shift from the zero-sum distributive negotiation frame that they usually come into the room with into a more integrative win-win frame as they come to realize that it's in everyone's interests to cut emissions globally and pay for what's needed to get that to happen. So what happens? Well, we ran it at the COP21 Paris climate meeting. As you can see, standing room only and quite crowded. And all kinds of people showed up, including this young gentleman here, who at the time was a high school student in China. And we usually have people play outside their normal roles. So that morning, I had this young man play the role of the President of the United States. And here he is giving his speech to the delegates, explaining what the U.S. position was in the role play. And let me just show you another little video showing just how intense and interesting these negotiations are. So here he is as the President of the United States negotiating with the other parties. What you need to remember here is this is a high school student with no particular knowledge of climate science or climate change before coming into the room. And he's developing his negotiation skills, his leadership skills, his public speaking skills, and learning how to work with all kinds of other people. So you might ask, well, people enjoy it, but does it work? We've now done research using pre- and post-test surveys to ask the question, does this experience help people learn more about climate science and economics, and does it engage them emotionally so that they're more likely to want to learn more and to take action in the real world? And the answer is an unequivocal yes. And we have a draft paper on this that we're about to submit for publication. World Climate so far has been played in nearly 650 events that we know of in over 70 countries around the world with more than 32,000 participants as of a couple of weeks ago. And you can see that it's been played nearly everywhere around the world, including in many developing nations. And it's entirely free. So you are able to go to climateinteractive.org, learn about this, get the model, get all the materials you need to learn how to run it for yourself. Most of these events have not been run by myself or people on our team, but by others who have learned how to run it in their local community, taking it out to their schools, their library, their Rotary Club, their house of worship. So I would encourage you to take a look at that and decide for yourself if it's something you might be interested in. Now, the question is, could any of these emissions reductions that we've been discussing as being necessary to have any decent chance of limiting the warming to 2 degrees C or 3.6 Fahrenheit, is there any chance that this can happen in the real world, not just in a simulated negotiation? And here, there's considerable good news. So the costs of carbon-free renewable energy have been falling very dramatically. Here you see the cost decline for wind power, now just a few cents per kilowatt hour, unsubsidized in any part of the world that has a decent wind resource. And as a result, exponential growth in global installed wind capacity, far faster than the forecasts, by the way. And indeed, in many parts of the United States and elsewhere in the world, Texas, for example, Oklahoma, the Midwest, wind power is now cheaper than fossil fuel, and this is one of the reasons that so many coal plants and even a few nuclear plants have been shut down. They simply can't compete anymore with this technology. And the same is true for solar power. Solar is smaller now than wind, but growing faster than wind. And it's, again, due to the strong experience curve, a 20% experience curve, meaning every time, on average, installed solar PV capacity doubles, the cost drops by 20%. That's a very substantial experience curve, and we're now below $1 per peak watt. which gets us unsubsidized solar prices at the holy grail of grid parity, meaning as solar gets cheaper and cheaper, it's now going to be cheaper, and in many places already is, cheaper than fossil electricity. And you can see in the top right that the actual growth of solar around the world has consistently, dramatically exceeded the forecasts. Here you see forecasts from the International Energy Agency. And as recently as the year 2002, they were projecting no significant growth in solar. And every year they've raised their forecast, but they've consistently fallen short. It's simply growing so fast that they can't keep up. Now, wind and solar are great. Storage technologies are coming along, but we need more than that. And efficiency turns out to be the single best investment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and put money in your pocket. And a great example of that is the new Sloan building here, where I speak to you from today, E62. We occupied the building in the year 2010. It's a LEED Gold building. It's won several awards. And you can see here, I won't go through them, a number of the sustainable design features that we incorporated into the building. More insulation, better windows, heat recovery ventilation, and so on and so forth. The question is, and this is a real question for all of you, what do you think the costs of the capital costs of these sustainable design features are? They're going to lower the energy cost of the building, but how much more did we have to spend in order to build these into the building? So take just 1 second and ask yourself, how much more did it cost? The typical answer is 10 to 20% more, or even more than that. This is the most frequent response when I ask the question of my students. Now, in fact, the building saves a great deal of energy, about 70% less energy used for heating and cooling, but most people think it was very expensive to do that. In reality, we did spend more on the insulation and the windows and so forth, but you can also see, let's back up just a second here, you can also see that we saved money in other places because the building uses so much less energy. So we spent more on the windows, the insulation, the air conditioning system, but then we saved money on less capital expense for the air distribution system, the air handling unit that does HVAC, the electrical substation that feeds the building because we use so much less power, and so forth. So when you add all that up, we spent about $2.3 million more on the sustainable features on a $140 million bottom line project, or only 1.6% more. But it's actually even better than that, because MIT, as the owner-operator of our facilities, has to provide the infrastructure to supply chilled water and steam for heating, cooling, and heating. And that infrastructure is very expensive. So that actually led to an additional saving of nearly $2 million in avoided capital costs. So when you add that all up, $2.3 million more for the green features of the building, minus $1.9 million in avoided utility costs, net incremental capital costs to build this building green, $340,000, or only 1/4% of the building cost. And this is quite typical around the world in terms of green buildings. They're far cheaper than people think they are in capital costs. And then there's the additional energy savings. So what this means is that the payback time on the Sloan sustainability features was less than a year, the ROI over 100% a year, and the net present value using MIT's actual cost of capital, nearly $10 million. This is a win-win, and there are many such win-wins available in the efficiency space. So let me stop here so we can move to questions and encourage you all to go to the climateinteractive.org site and check out our simulations for yourself, run your own scenarios for yourself. We don't ask you to accept our assumptions. We want you to try it out yourself. And we'll transition to questions at this point.
Great. Thank you, Professor Sterman. There's just so much to cover on this topic. We really appreciate it. As a reminder for everyone, please type in your questions for Professor Sterman in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. While you're doing that, I would like to take a moment to tell you about some of the upcoming events MIT Sloan will be hosting. Next month, alumna Sharon Masali, EMBA 2014, will provide industry insights on how publishers use data to curate and optimize articles, videos, and ads specifically tailored to your liking. And on July 11th, we have a special MIT Sloan Alumni Online with Professor Andrew Lowe. We also have some great opportunities coming up for you to connect with us in person. We will be hosting the Harnessing the Digital Revolution Conference with Professors Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McAfee in San Francisco on June 20th. And of course, MIT Sloan Reunion is taking place on campus June 8th through 11th. But enough of that, we're now moving on to your questions. We'd like to start today's Q&A with some spotlight questions that were submitted during the RSVP process. Our first question comes to you from Manny, who's a Sloan Fellow from the class of 2016 from London. And Manny asks, could you briefly describe the top 3 initiatives globally that we should be pursuing now?
Great. So, Monty, this is a terrific question, and thank you for taking the time to send it in advance. So the answer to this question is that there's no one best thing to do. And I know you asked for the top 3, but let's just remember what we have to do. In order to have any significant chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees C, 3.6 Fahrenheit, and remember, 2 degrees is not safe. It's just safer than 4 or any higher values. And we're already more than halfway there and experiencing harm from climate change today. But in order to have any chance to limit that warming to 2 degrees or less, we have to keep almost all the remaining fossil resources in the ground. In order to do that, while we keep a prosperous, healthy economy going, we have to expand efficiency and renewable energy as fast as possible. This is technically possible. We know what we need to do. But there's no silver bullet. What we need is to recognize that there's silver buckshot, and it's available now. Most of the technologies that we need to do this are off the shelf, ready to go. They will continue to improve as solar, wind, storage continue to get cheaper with technical progress. And the way to accelerate that adoption is, first of all, putting a significant price on carbon so that we pay the true costs of the fossil energy that we use, but without constraining people's free choice. This is the market-based solution for the climate problem. And as a professor here in the management school, I'm in favor of using markets to help solve this problem instead of command and control. And by the way, even as strong of a libertarian free market advocate as Milton Friedman, when asked what to do about pollution, his answer was simple. He said, tax it, of course. So that's the first thing that we need to do. We need to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels. So the actual price of carbon around the world right now today is negative because of the subsidies in many nations, including our own. We need stronger standards for efficiency. Energy Star LEED, which is a private sector standard, they do make a difference, and we need to encourage further strengthening of those. We need to provide financial and technical assistance for the developing nations so that they can leapfrog the fossil economy. This is in our interest. It's not only in their interest, it's in our interest so that conflict and migration and refugees and poverty are alleviated in these countries without destroying the climate. We need to reduce deforestation and land degradation, and we need to implement the Kigali Agreement that limits the F-gases and policies like the methane regulations that will limit leakage of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, eliminate black carbon, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And a number of these have quick payoffs. Carbon dioxide lasts in the atmosphere a long time, but black carbon, methane, they have shorter lifetimes and can make a difference in the short run. So I think the next, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yep, great. So our next question is from Allison, and Allison is an MBA from the class of 2018. And Allison asks what I can do as an individual to stop climate change.
This is a fantastic question, and one that I and the current students struggle with all the time. So I think the answer is multiple fronts. So first thing, cut your personal carbon footprint. You can retrofit your house. You can insulate your home or your condo or your apartment, upgrade your appliances, go solar if you can. And let me show you what I've done myself. So my wife and I, a couple of years ago, did a deep energy retrofit on our home. You can see it on the left here. There's solar on the roof now, but even more important, extensive insulation, new windows, high efficiency appliances, LED lighting, heat recovery ventilation, heat pump hot water, no fossil fuel used in the house now at all. And you can see in the first full year after the project was completed, we actually made 54% more energy than we used. So the electric utility now owes us a couple $1,000s. And the costs of doing this were rather modest. And the way that's true is we bundled it in with a renovation that the house, which was built in 1928, desperately needed. The result of this has been a drop in our carbon footprint for our house from quite significant to now negative. And you'll notice this starts in 1991 when we moved in. All the way along, we've been making some improvements. So you don't have to do a major project like this. You can get started on your own. And I'd like to shout out to Mark Dowdy and David Miller, who are other alums who have zero net energy homes, actually producing more than they use as well. And I bet there's other people out there in the audience right now who have zero net energy homes, and I'd love to hear from you. So if you've done that or anything even close to that, email me, send us the details. We'd love to hear from you. So taking personal action to reduce your carbon footprint is something that we all can do. It's not enough. We have to do more. And one of the other things that we would encourage you to do is get engaged with us here at MIT and at Sloan School. We now have a MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative, which is led by myself and Jason Jay and Bethany Patton and a number of other folks. Get involved with us. We run renewable energy finance roundtables. We're alums from all parts of the energy financing value chain, from operating facilities to venture capital to investment banking to startups, get together to talk about how they can help one another. You can get involved in our Climate Interactive projects. We have projects in other dimensions of sustainability. And shameless plug, you can direct your annual fund contribution to the Sustainability Initiative rather than just into the general pot. But there's still more that I think we can do and need to do. So you can get further engaged with MIT by supporting the campus climate action process. You can join Fossil Free MIT, a student and alumni organization that is advocating for this. You can support a stronger MIT climate action plan. And I think the best way to do that is send an email to Raphael, to President Reif. You see his email address right here, reif@mit.edu. Raphael announced a climate action plan in the fall of 2015. And it includes, for the first time, a significant commitment to reducing the campus carbon footprint and a variety of other actions to help MIT get engaged in this issue. And I would strongly encourage you to contact him, read about it online, then contact him and ask for it to be strengthened. And there's actually a committee underway right now that's looking exactly at that issue. So it's very timely to do that. John Deutsch is running that committee. What else can we do? Well, when the Climate Action Plan was announced, aspects of it were, to be perfectly blunt, somewhat weak. And so the Fossil Free group initiated a sit-in the very next day outside President Reif's office. That sit-in lasted for 116 days. And for most of it, the students were there 24/7. I have to tell you, this was a very impressive demonstration of the power of activism. Whatever your view is on the political issue here, it's really exciting to see the students getting engaged and alumni and some faculty. I'm in this picture way at the end there. But although I sat in for some of the time, really the credit goes for the students who put their butts down on the cold floor 24/7 And it was very respectful. There was no antipathy between the groups, and here you can see Raphael addressing the group, actually. It was a very respectful, civilized, and evidence-based discussion, and it actually led to some action on the part of MIT. You can also get involved with the MIT Alumni for Climate Action, and you see their email and their website here. There's more that we can do. So get active as a member of whatever your company or organization is. Find out what they're doing on sustainability and climate change. Offer to help strengthen and launch their programs. And encourage your organization to advocate with lawmakers for stronger climate action at every level of government. This is often a win-win for your company, for your industry, as well as for yourselves and your family, your children. Because as wonderful as it is to have Walmart and Google and Amazon and all these other companies getting engaged and committing to and deploying 100% renewables, they can't do it all alone. We need a harmonized set of policies that business can rely on so that uncertainty disappears and we can take stronger action. And then get active as a citizen. Learn to run the World Climate Role Play that I've just described. Bring it to your community and get active as a business leader in advocating for climate smart policies at every level. You could join E2, the environmental entrepreneurs, the business leaders for climate action, Deploy Us, Deploy US, all bipartisan, pragmatic folks, not taking a political view, appealing to both parties, and pointing out the win-win opportunities here. And then finally, I would say we have a larger duty. You need to get active as a citizen. So join an organization, contact your neighbors, talk to your people, your friends, your family, your colleagues, and get out there and start teaching. There's lots of ways to do this across the entire political spectrum. The Citizens Climate Lobby, nonpartisan. 350.org, more on the progressive side. And then there's Republic EN, Republic N. This is an organization of conservative, many evangelicals, strong Republicans, strong conservatives, advocating for significant climate action. There's also Mothers Out Front, which is a nonpartisan community of women and now men also, founded here in Boston, advocating for climate smart policies. And there's more. Get out there and march. Get out there and protest if you're so inclined. Hundreds of thousands of your fellow citizens have been marching for climate action, even just as recently as in April. And although you may have the impression this is entirely partisan, it's really not. People from all parts of the political spectrum have been out there advocating for policies that will create and preserve a sustainable world for all of us. Okay, now, what are the questions that we got?
Yes, so there are a lot of questions, unfortunately, way too many for us to get to in our time left. But a question we're getting a lot of is, where should we move geographically with all of this going on? And then second to that is, what should we be investing in?
Okay, well, so, if you live in a low-lying coastal region, Miami, the Netherlands, the obvious London, Shanghai, you might want to consider, selling your property before it's further devalued by sea level rise. But I got to tell you, there's nowhere to hide from this. People focus on sea level rise and the waters coming up through the storm drains in Miami now, even on sunny days, just due to the high tides. But there's nowhere to hide. If we don't cut global emissions dramatically as soon as possible, we're facing crop yield declines, we're facing mass migration, we're facing conflict, migration, refugees, disease ranges will expand. There is nowhere to hide. You might live in Denver, 4,000 or 5,000 feet above sea level. You're not safe there. You're safe from sea level rise directly, but not from the crop yield decline, not from the drought, not from the refugees. There's no wall around this country or any country high enough to protect us from those kinds of impacts. So the best thing you can do is work as aggressively as possible to mitigate emissions, to build that carbon-free energy system as quickly as possible, keep the fossil carbon in the ground, because there's nowhere to hide from this. In terms of where to invest, well, if you believe these are important issues and you care about preserving a healthy future for yourself, your children, and for all the children, divest your personal portfolio, your 401k, your other investments from fossil fuels. It makes no sense to advocate for climate smart policies and then provide capital for the fossil industry to keep digging it out of the ground and burning it. There are many such investment instruments that are available today that you can put into your portfolio as an individual in your retirement plan. They yield very nicely, thank you very much. And if your financial advisor doesn't offer them, ask them to fix that.
Great, thank you. And kind of going along the same vein of taking personal interest in what we can do, Karen Roos asks if you have a ballpark estimate of how people biking versus taking cars on shorter trips might affect overall CO2 emissions, and could actions like that be at all significant?
Well, first, hi, Karen. I hope you're doing really well. And as many of you may know, I'm a lifelong bicycle commuter. I rode in today. I ride in as many days a year as possible. And it definitely reduces my carbon footprint. I can't give you any numbers. It depends on the length of your commute, obviously. But I got to tell you, people sometimes say, well, you must be so personally committed to this issue that you're willing to ride in the rain and the snow and when it's below freezing and so forth. And my answer to that is, on the contrary, it's better for me. I feel better by doing that. It's a win-win. I cut my carbon footprint, sure, but I get exercise. I get out in nature every day. If I leave MIT with a lot of stress, which of course never happens, but if I do, by the time I get home on my bike, I feel better. If I drive home, I'm more stressed out than when I left. And during rush hour, biking is faster. So why not?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And with that, Professor Sterman, we want to say thank you so much for such an important discussion today at such an incredibly important time. This conversation has never been more important. So Sloanies and friends of MIT Sloan, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in the coming months for our future programs, which are made possible in part by the Sloan Annual Fund. As today's events close, we will ask you to complete a short survey to help us create programming that will be the most impactful to you. Until next month, thank you so much for joining MIT Sloan Online. Thank you, Professor Sterman.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everybody.